This episode of the Occasional Podcast is brought to you by the LSA Group, the new high-end, high-value speaker standard, and also Core Power, state-of-the-art power at real-world prices. Today's episode is also brought to you by Qobuz, lossless and high-res streaming and downloads. 50 million tracks in all genres in the best possible quality. Qobuz supports the audio industry and appreciates the needs of discerning audiophiles. Try it for free now at Qobuz.com. That's Qobuz.com. Welcome, friends, to the Occasional Podcast, Season 4, Episode 5. Everything you ever wanted to know about high-fidelity digital audio. Yeah! In this episode, we sit down with Alex Brinkman of Auralic Audio to weave through the navigation of digital audio, the ins and outs, kind of lets you know about the broad spectrum of information that's out there in terms of how to get high resolution, high fidelity digital playback from your devices, how to build a system, how to budget, all that good stuff. But for those of you just tuning in for a look at the basics, I'm going to kick that off right now with some very entry-level terminology to help you along the way, help you look at things and how you want to build your system. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of high fidelity, jump to the interview after the main theme, and that's when a little bit more of the sophistication will kick off. But just to get you up to date, generally speaking, there's a lot of digital products on the market right now. If you just listen on your cell phone, in a way, you're listening to digital audio. The music comes in from a source, be it a downloaded file or a stream from somewhere sourced on the cloud. And then it comes into your computer. And I think the number one thing that people can do to increase the quality of their digital audio experience is to get a digital audio converter, or what we call a DAC, get a better one in your system. There was some phones out there. I had a Samsung that had a Wolfson DAC. That was a pretty good listen, I thought. It was great. But a lot of phones are kind of cheap, so the quality that comes out of that isn't really great, and sometimes the stereo. So if you're looking to implement this, it usually goes after the source and before the amplifier. If we're looking, so source, DAC, amplifier, then transducer, so speaker or headphone after that point. Getting that higher quality DAC in there, I think, is the beginnings. Now, obviously, the thing that makes the music, the thing that creates the sound, I feel like is always one of the most important pieces, be it a pair of headphones or a pair of speakers. But this is also kind of one of those elements that you can twist and turn in order to get a little more sound quality out. With the computer, you can get these results for relatively cheap. I mean, there's some good DACs that will make a difference at the $100 mark. Cheaper than that, in $100, $200, there's even more. So for computer audio listening, that's where you start. But you can get pretty decent packages all in one, obviously. The Amazon Alexa, the Echo that they make, and Sonos, and these type of things kind of keep the package all together for you and make it simpler. High fidelity listening isn't really about keeping things super simple, though. So we kind of talk a little bit more about how to break it out, what they do, separate DACs, separate streamers, separate amplifier. And that's how you kind of tweak the system and make it your own. So a lot of good information. That's just some of the very basics. Now, let's kick it off with Alex Brinkman of Auralic. Everything you ever wanted to know about high fidelity digital audio. Today's episode is sponsored by Sonus Faber. Fine, handcrafted loudspeakers designed and manufactured in Vicenza, Italy. With over 35 years of advanced technological research and development, our elegant designs will allow you to experience an emotional connection with your music like never before. Discover your local dealer at sonusfaber.com. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. A very special guest to help us talk about digital audio, Alex Brinkman from Auralic. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking, Brian.
So the subject of digital audio is kind of a broad one, and I think a lot of it kind of comes out of the idea that we used to listen to analog forms of music. That was the sole thing, a record goes into a needle and out comes through amplification, we have music. And then with the evolution of the CD, we kind of moved into the way, and the idea of digital and the word digital started to drop quite often. As we move even further away from the CD, I think now, and maybe Alex, you have your own take on this, the idea of digital audio is moving even away from the CD to a sense of either downloaded files or streaming from streaming services. Would you say that's kind of the zeitgeist going on right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I see how Auralic products are used around the world, and there are definitely different country-specific uses for digital audio these days. And so it's really interesting to see where our products are used for one thing versus where our products are used for another. So every country has completely adopted the idea of streamed music services like Qobuz and Tidal, or Deezer, or Adagio, or any one of the great services out there today. Not every country has adopted that, and not every country has completely left the CD behind. So you have a really interesting use case when you're developing a product to make sure that you're covering everybody's possible use of a particular product. And as you said, digital audio is such a broad term these days that you can go from anybody can be listening to something like a CD, and that's considered digital, to a streaming service, to a locally stored file on a network. All of these things, to me, actually mean that digital is essentially an expansion of access to music in many formats and forms. And so that's kind of what's cool to me about digital. Analog tends to be pretty limited when it comes to access, but digital grants us the most options. It also grants us a great number of ways to screw things up, but it is certainly a high level of access. So, and to be clear, I think for me, what's cool about digital and analog, it is digital and analog. It is not a mutually exclusive thing when it comes to high-performance audio. Many of us have turntables and a streaming digital source. So,
right.
There are plenty of points of conflict in our world today, and to me, using analog and digital for their benefits is actually fantastic, right?
So let's speak to some of the benefits of each format, because I definitely think there is a tactile feel to the analog, to the record sleeve, and I think there's a lot of people that find the sound of tubes very endearing to them. But on the flip side, with digital, I definitely think that one of the main benefits is convenience. You can basically, if you have your service coming from Amazon's Alexa, you can call the song you want out of the air, whatever. The convenience is maximized. You don't have to even touch anything these days. But on top of that, there's a navigation, a discovery, and there's a lot of search engines like Pandora and stuff that will actually help curate stuff for you. And there's some pretty good playlists on the streaming services as well. Any other kind of benefits you adhere to digital or analog specifically, Alex?
As I mentioned, to me, they go hand in hand. So I think there are a lot of users that can possibly relate to my particular lifestyle. I'm a proud owner of a Fern and Roby Montrose turntable. A little shout out to Christopher
That's
Hildebrand.
a nice table.
Yeah,
it's a nice table.
So I love my Fern and Roby Montrose. It's definitely a ritual for me to get to listen to analog. And so frequently what happens is I'll find myself in the evening listening to music after the kids have gone to bed, and I'll maybe be listening to Qobuz or Spotify, and I'll find myself down a rabbit hole of related artists. I come across something that I really love, right? I think this is actually how I found the Avett brothers, for example, or Avett brothers. I don't know how it's pronounced, simply because I see it read more often than I hear it. But I'll discover the music, and if I truly love the performer or the artist or the recording, I'll then commit to archiving that piece of music on analog. And so I use digital as a way to discover new music and to listen to it, and as you said, a very convenient manner. but then I will make the commitment to purchasing the LP, not just because I love analog, but also as a sign of respect to the artist. Right? They
Right.
you like their music and you want to do more than just listen to it in the ether. You want to make it a physical example of your vote of yes. So yeah, that kind of describes in a roundabout way. Sorry, the benefits of both worlds. Right? Discovery and convenience and access all come from digital. I love it. And, with the technology companies like, obviously, I'm going to say Orlick and others like us are coming out with today, you've got great sounding digital happening now. So it's not just easy, it's also great sounding. But then you have companies like Fernan Roby, SME, VPI, all those guys making great products in a long-standing tradition that makes music also sound fantastic. And it provides us with a great way to sort of have a variety. On Tuesday, maybe I want to chop carrots in the kitchen and listen to music through my Sonos by just simply saying the name of an album or something like that, like you said. But on Saturdays, maybe I want to kick back with a whiskey and listen to my Avett Brothers album on my turntable.
Yeah, I really like that idea. And, it's a doorway, it's a transition, and the two are not mutually exclusive kind of endeavors. So I really appreciate that, and I do think we're all in this together. And just for the love of music and even just the love of technology on both ends, there's so much fun stuff going on. So let's think now about, what do we really need to get started in digital audio, and what are really, when we take a step back, the different options in your mind for listening in this front?
There are so many places a person can start with this, right? And you don't even have to really try. If you want, you can simply pick up your iPad and order an Amazon Echo right now. It'll show up tomorrow or the next day, and you're on some level doing streaming. But we're in the world of high performance audio. And to me, it's really about sort of enhancing your experience. And so what we really do at Orlick and other sort of digital-focused companies is we understand that there has for a long time been a pre-existing ecosystem that is the stereo system. And so the stereo system, a guy, Bob, say in his mid-50s, might already have an integrated amplifier and a great set of speakers. All he needs is to introduce the ecosystem of streaming into his life. And so what we do is we provide products like streamer-only boxes that you can plug the output of a product like this into the input of a multi-input DAC and download our app to your iPhone, and you're off to the races. It's that easy. You're streaming Qobuz, Tidal, whatever you want to do. But I think the first step when it comes to performance-oriented is, in most cases, you're going to have a guy who has a DAC and needs to basically get a streamer and to control that streamer. And I just described that process, right? But then you've got guys who might not even have a DAC. Maybe they're like analog worshipers for the last 25 years, and they didn't even purchase USB DACs when those were in vogue, 10 years ago. So maybe they just need an all-encompassing product. But I would recommend that they pick up a product that has streaming capabilities plus digital to analog conversion. That's essentially the breakdown of the two types of products that we build, and a lot of other companies also do the same thing. So at the end of the day, I think my recommendation is get yourself a streamer. Read a little bit about the software before you do it, because research on the software front is something that I'd recommend people really pay attention to. Software is what you're interacting with when you use a product like this. It's not the box. You might go 2 weeks without looking or feeling the box that you purchased, but the software you're looking at every single time you use that product. So that's the key.
And I just want to kind of jump in here too to say that there are all-encompassing DACs with streaming capabilities. There's streamers, and then there are obviously separate DACs that just have input. So for those who are ever confused about the subject, I would say that there is a certain benefit to separates in that you can change up the streamer if you want to try a different, like you were saying, software. Or maybe you think you might irk out a little bit more sound quality from that, but that's a controversial subject for some. But if you want to just try something different, I think that flavor is there if you want to. Yeah, I think right now, too, when you look at the overall landscape, DACs have been around for a while, and they have quite a bit of different flavors out there available.
Oh, yeah.
Now, when you look at the streamer market, That's a relatively newer kind of thing. I would say 5 to 10, and there are relatively less. So I feel like it's one of those categories that's still growing in a way, and that's also why some controversy swirls around it. But
Yeah.
on the DAC front, there are a couple of different options. There's been a strong following of Delta Sigma, which is a type of DAC chip, and there's also more customized options, sometimes referred to as ladder DACs or even other separate ring DACs in these types. I think all of them kind of have their place. But are you guys at Arlic, are you still focused on the Delta Sigma chipsets?
Yeah, we are. We are currently, and it's funny because I love this discussion because no matter where you go in high-end audio, I was just earlier talking about how no, analog and digital aren't mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. I think it's really interesting that in high-end audio, we'll always find a way to divide ourselves into different types of people, right? Even though all of us love audio and we all presumably love music, we always find a way to get our little tribal camp. And I like this kind of DAC chip and you like that kind of DAC chip. But what we have to remember when we're in these forums and having these conversations with our friends or strangers we meet at audio shows is that the decisions you make when you're a manufacturer are not the types of decisions that are made when you're just discussing the philosophy of a particular DAC chip's topology. So you have to make decisions that are commercially relevant. You have to make decisions that will ensure you can support your customer over the long run. You need to deal with companies that are responsible and ethical and transparent about how they develop their DAC chips and for how long they're going to be supporting them. And you have to make sure that the DAC chip you choose is going to be of a high level of performance. And so all of these factors go into that decision. I've worked at 3 companies, all of which have chosen particular DAC topology or a DAC chip, and it's never been the case that it was a pure performance choice. It's always, how can I honor my customer and choose performance? That's a really important relationship you have to sort of reconcile, is making sure that you're honoring your customer and making sure you're getting the best out of the performance. Make it easy to use, make it supportable over the long term, and make it high performance. And so we use ESS variants in all of our products right now. Those are Delta Sigma designs.
And that's a really great point. And I also want to just say, too, in terms of like these chip camps, and like a lot of things in audio and even in life, not one thing is often contributing to all of the sound. So another way to put that is implementation matters greatly. You can have a very poor performing Delta Sigma chip with bad implementation, and I've heard ones at very, very high expensive that sound absolutely phenomenal. The same can go for a ladder DAC or a ring DAC. Generally speaking, those are custom off execution, so they have a lot more attention, a lot more R&D dollars behind them, but they don't, in and of itself, make the DAC sound great. It's implementation, it's programming, it's so many different things that go into making it sound good. And let's not forget, power supplies are a huge element for a lot of people for that, and isolation and these types of noise reducing things. So for those who are like, oh, Delta Sigma doesn't sound great, or it's always got to be something, I would just say, let's think about implementation and the reputation of the company. Generally speaking, if you want to get into digital audio, you're really looking at picking up something that provides a source, be it a streamer, and then either implement it into that. Something with analog outs would be something that has a built-in DAC or a separate DAC to an amplifier and then to a speaker. You can also purchase all of these things in one in kind of the same product category that we talked about originally, like an Amazon Alexa. But if we're talking about high-end audio, which this is a high-end show, usually we go about it with separates. So in that same token, a big element of this is how you control the streaming, how you control serving up these digital files through software. And you had mentioned that you guys have developed your own custom software. You want to just kind of explain how that works?
Yeah, so really it's about the renderer or the piece of hardware, and then you've got your control point. And so for us, the control point is essentially an app that we developed. It's an app-based protocol. It's iOS only, so we really found that using Apple products within that architecture makes it a lot easier for us to make sure that we're up to date with any protocols, any updates we're aware of. We're always able to update the app in the Apple ecosystem. Anything else was making it very difficult. The Android platform was very difficult to support. So we had to really make a choice. It's an unfortunate choice, but we had to make a choice to really adhere to the iOS platform. Lightning handles a few different functions for us. So in our streamer products, Lightning DS allows us to control the streaming functionality from an iPhone or an iPad, and Lightning Server allows us to serve those files from a NAS drive of some kind. So some of our products are more of a DAC and online streamer focused product that don't use our server software because generally speaking, those users aren't going to have need for local stored files. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode, we were talking about how different markets have different preferences for how they listen to music. So in the United States, a lot of our customers do have locally stored files, but you're finding as we progress that a lot of customers are actually not focusing as much on those locally stored files as testament to these streaming services. They're able to access most, if not all, of the music that they like through the streaming services. And if they don't, of course, they can, like I said, use a NAS drive. So anyway, back to the control. So controlling the product is really about communicating via Wi-Fi from your iPad or your iPhone to the router. The router communicates that information to the streamer to output the appropriate file or stream of online music. That's basically how it works. The streamer is a way of connecting or linking your local network and the internet to your stereo system in the simplest terms.
Yeah, and I think one of the really cool things about this is that you can pull in the files from anywhere. So you can have different services pull them in, and you can have them stored locally, just as you were saying. So you can mix in the stuff that you own digitally with the stuff that you just stream in, and the whole thing is seamless and ubiquitous. This is really, to me, one of the great advantages of these type of softwares now, is that we're to the point where it's a seamless experience from what's stored locally and what's stored out in the cloud that comes down. And are your products Roon endpoints as well?
I mean, I don't know too many companies that aren't Roon compatible and don't avail themselves of Roon services. Roon is, I've said this many times, I'm a supporter of Roon, but the differences between our companies are really interesting to me because where we are 80% hardware and 20% software, Roon is 80% software and 20% hardware, meaning that our efforts have really been towards developing hardware and developing software as a way to control that hardware, whereas Roon's efforts have really been to develop a great piece of software that is definitely sophisticated and heavy when it comes to processor requirements. We don't, to be clear, make a Roon core, which you require in order to run Roon at home. But we all of our products are Roon endpoints, and so you can point Roon's use directly to our product and play all of your music, organize your music, and integrate your system, be it from Orlick or any of the other companies that make Roon endpoints. You can have an integrated system all controlled by Roon, which is really cool.
Well, I think that it's interesting because Roon is a control software. You guys actually have your custom software. And then when you start to look at things, there's also like AirPlay. And Sonos has its own thing too for their specific products. It allows you to disseminate the music to different areas. You can even actually achieve this with Alexa products from Amazon to a degree by saying, play this particular song here or all over. That one I just learned recently too. You can actually do it simultaneously just by commanding them to do it. But I guess the one thing I wanted to point out with Roon and your software, they're high end, they're audiophile centric, and they will allow you a greater degree of control to send high resolution files. When we start to get to AirPlay specifically, there is a limit to how much bandwidth you can send through at any time. Now, it will downsample. It might not sound bad, but if you're going for a more purist standpoint, I would recommend moving over to either Roon or your custom software, Lightning, or even some other kind of custom options because the AirPlay doesn't necessarily stream what they would call bit
Yeah, I mean,
perfect
I think of AirPlay as a great, and our products support AirPlay, but I think of AirPlay as a convenience item. You're not sitting down to listen to a symphony piece with AirPlay, generally speaking, unless you want your kid to sit down for 5 minutes and listen to classical music. But you know what I'm saying? Like, if you're seriously listening to your music, you're generally speaking not going to be using AirPlay. But if you find an interesting piece of music and you want to shoot it over to the stereo system real quick from your phone, AirPlay, it's a super easy way to do it, right?
So, from your experience with all these different options, locally stored files, streaming, do you have any kind of tips or preferences? How do you think streaming performs next to locally stored files in the
Oh
digital
man,
side?
that's a great question. I think that locally stored files are great if you really want to be sure of the provenance of the recording you're playing back. If you want to be sure that it's a 24.192 file being streamed to your system from your NAS drive at 24.192, then locally stored files are the way to do it. If it's a piece of music that maybe was on a CD and it was 16-bit 44, but it was the only CD because it was some weird band you discovered at a pizza place and you bought their CD from the drummer and you've never seen that band ever again, and Spotify or Qobuz or Tidal have no idea who Bob Hemsworth is, right? You can certainly store that file and preserve it and have access to it over your local network using our products. So that's great. The streaming services, generally speaking, unless you are some 20 terabyte crazy dude, generally speaking, the streaming services like Qobuz, Tidal, Spotify Connect, etc., they're going to have more music available to you that you might not have thought of. That's what's interesting to me about online streaming is the access, the catalog, and the curation of those particular collections are really cool. The downside, of course, is that you never know when you're no longer going to have access to a particular title on online streaming, So that's kind of the downside there.
In a mobile sense, at least, a lot of the services will provide you with an offline mode for the app, which means that you download the files to locally. So there is some safety net, I think, in regards to disconnect. But for the most part, you're not going to be able to get fresh stuff if you lose your connection.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that liability.
And conversely, you're not going to be able to be on the road with your phone and listen to your files in general, have the choice of all of your 24.192 high-res files simply by limitation of the phone and the fact that you probably haven't stored all 10 terabytes of your music on your phone. So yeah, there's also that.
One other thing I wanted to drop in here in regards to AirPlay, I think I just want to go back to, is that also Bluetooth is an option, but from a high fidelity standpoint, I feel like this is one of those arenas, they're still working on it. It's not quite ready for prime time when it comes to high resolution audio
Bluetooth,
playback.
It's coming along. There have been more iterations since the initial, what I would consider to be fairly low performance debut of Bluetooth when it comes to a sound perspective. But yeah, it's making improvements, but it's still not really where we need to be. And the only bummer about that is if you have a few friends come over and they want to play music that's only on their phone, that might be an issue. But once again, we can go back to the fact that most of us have streaming services that we subscribe to, and I can hand my phone over to a friend and he can find music on Qobuz, Tidal, or Spotify that he wants to play, and we can do that via AirPlay. There are plenty of other ways around Bluetooth. It's no longer the panacea or the fallback position that it used to be. So,
when you think about an individual with a budget set aside for high fidelity listening, how do you think about budgeting that on a component basis? So where does someone spend X amount of percentage of their budget in your mind?
Well,
for the best possible quality.
So when it comes to budget for this sort of thing, I really like to take into account what a person thinks they can spend, what the rest of their system is like, right? You don't want to embarrass your system by giving it a product that's not quite up to snuff. In terms of digital, what I find really interesting about the category is that you have a lot of products that are still performance-based, but they're able to offer so many different features because, as we've been talking about, so much of digital audio has to do with software, and adding those features on doesn't have the cost basis that you do when you're talking about adding features that are hardware-based. So that's what's really cool about the digital category today, is you can get great functions at a very entry-level price. So, I think that we might not make any of these products, but I think that starting at the $1,000 to $2,000 price range, you're starting to hit a lot of products that offer competitive features for not too much money that are going to help you get started. If you don't feel like going to the $2,000 to $3,000 price range, which is where we start, you're still able to get functionality and feature set out of those products. The only downside is that if you aren't ready to go into something like an Orlick range, you are going to be changing the kind of software that you use, generally speaking, right? You might start with like Blue Sound, and then you move over to something like whatever Cambridge is offering or whatever Name is offering. And then, you know what I mean? Like when you start skipping around to different software architectures, your user experience does change. So it's really important. Again, I guess I'm going to emphasize this a few times. It's really important to focus on what kind of software you want to be using throughout the life of your sort of digital journey, we'll call it.
Yeah, mine actually started kind of with a product called the Squeeze Box by Logitech.
Ooh, yeah, nice.
And that guy, I didn't even know. It was very archaic in nature from what they gave you, but a third-party person came in and made a pretty sweet software that allowed you to aggregate different sources together, and it blew my mind the first time I used it. But you know what happened is it was woefully unreliable. Like software crashes or things not pulling in. Stability in the software becomes a very paramount thing to avoid frustration, I feel like. So that's something that I look for in the software. Is the UI, of course, is important. The curation, if there is some type, is also really fun. But stability, I feel like, is like if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. That's what sometimes when I'm writing reviews, I just write, this software works. And it is a key feature, in my opinion, because when it works, that's like a big chunk of the, let's just say, less kind of robust systems that are out there. They don't work. I think, generally speaking, in terms of budgeting, I always like to emphasize the thing that makes the sound should have a lot of money put towards it. But every part of the chain does matter. If you have and if you think about it at the weakest link kind of idea almost, where if you have something really good, but it's bottlenecked by something that's not so hot, so everything matters. But once you kind of get your system to a place where you want it to be, I cannot emphasize enough, the source matters.
Oh, yeah.
You were mentioned before, the provenance of the file matters. And the studio and the mics that were recorded all matter in terms of what the outcome of the sounds like. So it's really important not to overlook or cheap on any one part of the chain. But once you have a good sounding setup, I feel like the source is revealed even more to you. Once you can hear what that thing's like through fidelity, that it becomes even vitally important to kind of like put that last finish, the polish on the music. So that's kind of how I look at those kind of things. Do you, in terms of high resolution, where do you sit on this sometimes controversial subject of high resolution audio? Do you feel like it makes a difference to the sound from your personal experience, or does everything after CD Redbook quality, is it just kind of excessive?
To me, high resolution is only a description of the potential. It's not necessarily an absolute description of quality. Quality is, like you said, determined at many steps along the way in the creation of a recording. The mastering engineer, quality of the mics, like you said, everything has a place in creating a great recording. After that, if the recording is good quality, then it's possible that if, for example, you've mastered it at 24:192 and you have a high resolution copy of that 24:192 recording, you are going to have theoretically, possibly, a great sounding recording. And that's still assuming that you've got a system good enough to render that. A DAC chip that can actually perform natively at 24,192. So all of this stuff, like you said, feeds into it. But to me, no. High resolution, and I'm guessing most people are still considering high resolution to be anything 2496 or 24192 and above. To me, that's just a description of the potential quality of a recording, and that's that. It means very little to me. I've heard 16-bit 44 sound incredible, and I've heard 24,192 or 32,384 or DSD whatever sound horrible. So it's just not, those descriptors to me are not enough to guarantee quality.
Well put. And I would like to say that there are some hi-fi manufacturers that are still trying to push the envelope on CD playback. They're still making new CD players. Now, while the technology is kind of getting overshadowed by digital, they are still trying to push the quality that you can squeeze out of a CD. So if you are a big CD holder and you don't want to give that up, maybe it's not time to sell all those CDs. Well, Alex, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Hey, no problem, Brian.
Thank you for listening to the Occasional Podcast Season 4. The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, the Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.